right, so how many people here own a chainsaw? Yeah? All right.
It won't start.
And those that don't, you're going to want to buy one after tonight. All right, the inspiration for this book was the time I spent working as a line clearance tree trimmer. And up in the photo here, that's a transmission line running through some forest land. And that's where I worked every day. The goal is to prevent trees from falling into the power lines. That causes blackouts. Everybody knows after thunderstorms that happens constantly. And the job is to prevent that. The biggest blackout in the United States was, I think it was 2003, and it knocked out most of the East Coast and parts of Canada. Wisconsin was untouched, but I think parts of Michigan were knocked out. It was a blackout night sky event. So the job is to be able to look down that right-of-way, and anything sticking out gets whacked. And so some of the trees, it's called phototrophism. That means the trees are always growing towards the light, that open gap in the right-of-way. They're hungering towards that sunlight. Our job is to knock it back. Any twig, branch, or tree sticking out gets cut. There's kind of like a point man that will go through sometimes and mark trees for us, flag them or spray paint them, whatever. And then we'll go out on like a search and destroy mission and hunt them down and drop them. Sometimes the tree doesn't need to be completely removed and only a branch needs to be cut. But the branch is 25 feet off the ground. So that means you got to climb the tree, or if we can get a bucket truck back in there, we go up in a bucket and cut it with a saw. So we use chainsaws every day. That was our main weapon in this war against constant vegetative regrowth. We were cutting brush, we were cutting invasive species, and everything to super large, gigantic oak trees, both dead and alive. My most memorable oak tree was one that we cut. It was between here and Wild Rose. It was in someone's yard. And my partner, when he was cutting into it, red water started gushing out. It looked like he cut into, it was a hollow tree, at least that part. I thought he cut into a family of raccoons, and it was their blood coming out, but it wasn't. It was just the tannins of the oak tree gave it that color, that colored water, sap water. It wasn't really sappy, but that part of the tree was dead. And I would say probably 30 gallons of water poured out. It was pretty remarkable. You see a lot of interesting things. A lot of weird objects end up in trees. Often it's barbed wire from fencing. You cut into that and it screws up the teeth of your saw. So I became really fascinated with chainsaws, and I wanted to read more, but there's not too much literature out there. It's very scattered. There are some books that are instructional in nature, and I wanted to kind of go deeper and explore the wide world of chainsaws. The best advice about that is write the book you want to read. So that's what I did. I think the chainsaw is probably the most unrecognized technological innovation in the last century. The computer, the automobile, they get all the attention, and many other inventions. But the chainsaw transformed so many things in the world, especially in the world of logging. Waupaca, I was talking with Tracy earlier, had multiple sawmills. Stevens Point up the road is nicknamed the gateway to the pineries, the big logging areas where they logged white pines. I think Bear Creek, their nickname is gateway to the Northwoods. So the history of logging in Wisconsin is huge and influential. And that led to the chainsaw culture that we have now, because we're blessed with these fantastic forests. So, I also cut firewood. And I put up enough to get through every winter, and then also I like to have a lot of extra on hand. And as I was thinking about the chainsaw and how great it was, I thought to myself, this work would really suck if I did not have a chainsaw. And I thought back to the old days of the early loggers using crosscut saws and buck saws and axes, and I thought how brutal the work is. There's that ridiculous phrase, firewood warms you twice, once when you cut it and once when you burn it. That's insane. You fell the tree, and then you take off the limbs, and then you buck it into small sizes for firewood. It's on the ground, you gotta pick it up, you gotta move it somewhere, load it into a trailer, take the trailer to some spot, unload it again, and then you gotta split it. And then that's on the ground, you pick it up again, stack it. And then you gotta get it into the house where the fireplace or wood stove is. The amount of physical labor, even with the chainsaw, is enormous. So to add the manual labor aspect of cutting and felling with primitive tools, it's even more laborious. There's a nickname of the crosscut saw. It had two nicknames. It was called the misery whip and the Swedish fiddle. I guess that's from the Scandinavian immigrants that were up in the North Woods. But the misery whip really is a perfect nickname for it, because you have a guy on that end and a guy on this end cutting a log back and forth. And imagine doing that for 10 hours a day. Imagine how sore your shoulders would be. And I imagine you start hating the guy on the other end too after a while, or you become best friends, either way probably. So that leads to the history of the chainsaw and what it was like. There's my firewood pile. There was a quest for what people often called the endless saw. And a lot of the early inventors that were experimenting with chainsaw prototypes had this vision of a saw that just doesn't stop, and it's operated by some kind of a machine. Some of the early ones, the ideas were that it would be kind of like a bandsaw, just constantly revolving around and around. But nobody could figure out a way on how to make it happen. One of the first chainsaws was hand operated, and it was invented by a doctor. It looked like an egg beater that you hand crank, and there was a little pointy end with a small chain, like a bicycle chain going around there with teeth. And it was used, I believe, for women during pregnancy to cut into the cervix or something like that, which sounds pretty gruesome. Yeah. So that was one idea of a saw, and then it kept going and going. Another one, this is a reciprocating saw, much like a Sawzall. There, the saw blade just goes back and forth like that with machine power. That was one concept. But then the idea of the saw being part of a chain that rotates, that concept started emerging more and more in chainsaw design. The problem is they were gigantic. They were hauled out into the woods. They were extremely heavy. Some of the early ones, you need a horse to drag it in, or an early automobile. And also I'd like to point out the comparison of automobiles and chainsaws. People all around the world were working on this concept of an endless saw. So it was a lot like the automobile. There was tons of early automobile manufacturers cranking out their designs, until what we have now. The Fords and Chrysler and all those companies rose to the top. Eventually, just like any other tech, the product gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it becomes more usable. And finally, it gets down to the two-man saw. So if you look at these laid out here, there's the power head on one end with a throttle and some handles. And then on the other end is just a handle for another guy to hang on while the other guy rips it. So that's how it started out. The machine got smaller and smaller and smaller until it was a two-man version. But even that was insanely heavy and bulky to move around. Finally, Andre Stihl in Germany got the chainsaw into the shape of what we know now as what a chainsaw looks like. It's a one-person tool that can be operated with two hands, and he would be considered the godfather of modern chainsaws. He's the one that brought it all together. And then World War II came along, and he was an industrialist that got co-opted by the German war movement. And at the time, he had his saws circulating in Canada and the US in the logging industry, trying to sell them. Well, once the United States entered the war, the whole idea of like patents and patent designs and all that went out the window. And American manufacturers started copying his ideas on how to take a chainsaw and turn it into a one-man tool. So the post-war boom, post-war industrial activity was an explosion of chainsaw designs. There were manufacturers popping up all over the place. Everyone was getting into the action. In my garage, I have an old chainsaw I want to restore. It's a Remington, same as the gun company. Husqvarna, they got in later in the game. Homelight, that became the American-made leader in chainsaws. And everyone here has probably seen a Homelight chainsaw at one time. So, in the history of chainsaw design, there's two milestones. One is Andre Stihl getting the saw compacted into a one-man tool. The second is the chain itself. There's a guy named Mr. Cox who was out on I think it was the Pacific Northwest, doing some logging work. He was a jack of all trades. And at the time, the chainsaws were scratcher chains. A scratcher chain it scratches. It's just pointy little teeth, triangle shaped. And it just scratched the wood back and forth. And it didn't cut very well. Mr. Cox, I guess he was taking a break, and he looked at some pine beetles, these grubs, and they were eating through the wood. He's like, how do they do that? They just chew right through the wood. So I got a magnifying glass and studied them. And he noticed they didn't cut or scratch. Instead, they gouged into the wood back and forth, like that. And he invented the Oregon chain, which revolutionized how chainsaws operate. His design, the teeth go one way and another way, and they're curved, so they bite. And they, instead of creating sawdust, they create chips, tiny, smaller chips. If you've used a sharp chainsaw, you notice the chips go flying. When your chainsaw is really dull, you get more of a sawdust on the ground. His business exploded. It became internationally known. The company was Omark, if that rings a bell to some people. And today, those two brands, Stihl and Oregon, are in business. You can buy a Stihl chainsaw. Well, no. Fleet Farm has Husqvarna's. You can get a Stihl chainsaws at Nofke Lumber. They're a dealer, and they also service them too. And you can also buy Oregon chains just about everywhere. You can swap Oregon chains onto just about any saw. So those, in the history of chainsaws, those were the two big high points. So after the chainsaw was invented, just like any other technology, after that, those two big breakthroughs, after that it was just refinement, making it better and better and better. And those refinements help made the chainsaw a lot safer, because the early chainsaws were super dangerous. So all these add-ons, the picture there is, those are called felling dogs, bumper spikes. There's a lot of name for them. A lot of guys just call them saw dogs. And those are on the front of the power head, located up here. This one doesn't have it. This is a battery-powered saw, but they're mounted up here. Some saws have one, some have even two of them. Those, when you're cutting into both felling and also bucking, those help stabilize the saw when you're cutting and adds a little bit of a leverage point. Those come with on a store-bought chainsaw, you'll have felling dogs, but you can also add custom ones, such as this, that are really aggressive looking. So the most important thing is the chain brake. The early chainsaws didn't have them. They just kept going and going until you killed the motor. Imagine how dangerous that is and working around that. The modern chain brake, it's just one hand like that. You just pop it, push it, and let her rip. Hit it, and it stops. That's saved, I don't even know how much blood it has prevented from hitting the ground. But this is probably the most important innovation. Another one is the centrifugal clutch. Again, this is electric, so it's different, but there's a clutch. When you're revving the saw and you let off the throttle, the chain slows down to an idle. The early saws didn't have that. So when you're cutting, you bring it up and you stop, that chain is still going super fast. And you can't be walking around with that thing flying. So it automatically slows down. That's another one. Another one, this saw does not have it, and it's a chain catcher. It's a little flared, kind of like a spiky looking thing made out of aluminum usually. And what happens is sometimes your chain, it sits on a bar in a groove, and it will come flying off. It will ride up off the bar and just get all tangled. A chain catcher right here prevents it from coming back at you. Also, your chain sometimes breaks. It just snaps and it just goes flying wildly. And the chain catcher will grab it. If you look on a well-used chainsaw, you'll see the chain catcher all nicked up and stuff like that. Then the other one is back here. There's a hand guard, and again, that protects your hand from anything coming back towards here. The safety throttle interlock is a trigger here, and then usually some kind of button on the side. You grab them and press them at the same time, and you're good to go. That prevents, if there wasn't an interlock, imagine your chainsaw is running, all ready to go, warmed up, and you're walking through a whole bunch of brush, and a stick gets caught in there, and you turn, and then suddenly it revs up. So That's why it has a 2-point system. The kill switch is another one. The kill switches on most chainsaws are back here on the power head. And that's obvious. Sometimes you need the machine to be turned off immediately. A lot of the early chainsaws, they're crazy looking contraptions, and you'd probably have to study it quickly to figure out how to turn it off. Whereas a modern chainsaw, those are very well marked, and all you have to do is push it down and it's off completely. Another one is called the spark arrestor on gas-powered saws. It's like a little muffler up here, and sparks will come out. It's a small little screen that when a spark hits up there, it gets extinguished. And that's to prevent forest fires. If you're cutting on any government land that's run by the U.S. Forest Service, it's a requirement that they have them. If you don't have one on your saw, you'll get a fine. And then another one are anti-vibration devices that are put on saws. The early chainsaws vibrated violently to the point that they would get, I think it's called Raynaud's syndrome. Another name for that is white finger. White finger is recognized by OSHA as an occupational induced malady. And your fingers would turn white. You're holding onto this vibrating machine for hours on end all day, and then you start losing circulation and sensitivity and get arthritis-like effects. So I mean, it'd be like hanging onto a jackhammer all day, I guess. The anti-vibration, if you look on your saws, they're little springs. Some are springs, some are like rubber cushions that absorb that violent vibration that the motor is creating. And then, let's see, then there's felling sights. If you look on your gas-powered saw up on the power head, you'll see a horizontal line. It's usually a black little, just a simple line. And that's like a gun sight. So you're standing next to this tree, you want to cut it down, you're going to make your notch cut, and then your back cut. So you put the bar up against the tree, you look on the line, let's see, the house is there, the other house is there, I need to drop it right in between. So you take that line and you look, and you mark it off, and then you start making your notch cut. So in the history of chainsaw development, all these little small improvements were made, mostly though for safety, because it was a very dangerous tool in the early days. There's a bow saw. That was one of the early designs. That's Mr. Dan Stuckman. He's in my book. He's a chainsaw restoration master. He's restored hundreds of saws. That, again, is like that concept of the endless saw, this rotating, cutting teeth chain. That was put on this bow-shaped. That was, I think, made by Poland back in the early days. And I tested it out, and it was kind of awkward at first, but it cut great, especially in the bucking sense. When I say bucking, that means the tree is down, and now you're cutting it into making vertical cuts, whether they're for logs to go to the lumber mill or small pieces destined for your fireplace. And if you look at that, there's something really different about it. Compared to this one, the bar is on the opposite side of the power head. It's a chainsaw for lefties. All chainsaws that you buy in modern times are all right-handed. And that's just the way it turned out. There are a few, very few chainsaws were made with that design. They're very rare. And part of that is Well, I'll get to that in a moment, but there's also a bunch of safety concerns. If this bar was on this side and the saw would kick back, that would be coming right towards your head. If it's just a few inches on the other side, on the right side, if it comes back, it'll just go by your ear. You've probably seen this sign down by Waupaca, right? Okay. Now this is our connection to chainsaw history and pop culture. So, Mr. Robert Bloch, who was a novelist, was married to a woman from Waupaca. He stayed with her in her hometown for a few years, and at that time, Ed Gein in Plainfield committed his atrocious crimes. It is thought that Bloch was inspired from that to write the novel Psycho. And then the Lakeshore Motel is thought to be the hotel in the book. The novel became famous. Alfred Hitchcock optioned it to make a film. The film became probably the true film that inspired the entire genre of horror movies. That was the film that started off everything. So, the horror film business exploded, and one movie took inspiration from Psycho and also Ed Gein, and that was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the film, the most evil character is called Leatherface because his face is like a human skin mask that is very grotesque, and Ed Gein also did that type of horrific stuff. So that's the connection that led up to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was an incredibly influential film when it first came out in I think it was the early 70s. That blew the doors open on the whole slasher and blood and gore part of the horror film genre. Ever since then, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I don't even know how many sequels they're up to now, part 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's an entire franchise. Chainsaws then became prominent in all of Hollywood, mostly as a tool of total destruction and mayhem and total bloodbath. Well, that in turn kind of changed the public consciousness. People that were unfamiliar with chainsaws looked at them as something that's insanely dangerous. And yeah, it's a powerful tool, and it can be dangerous in the wrong hands. So that was the public perception that still exists today. It's a trope in Hollywood movies, and the biggest parody of that is in the best Christmas movie ever, which is National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation with Chevy Chase, where he steps out of the garage and he's wearing the hockey mask and starts revving the chainsaw. And then he cuts down the neighbor's evergreen tree because he needs to swap out his other tree. And and then he cuts off the newel post in the house, if you remember that. And it's a joke. He's parodying chainsaws in all of film culture. That's how widespread it is. No other tool, other than like guns, knives, and axes, have that kind of scary effect on people. So that's how chainsaws really came into popular culture. And here's T.J. Howell. I interviewed him for the book. The world's most dangerous juggler. most dangerous. Why? Because he juggles chainsaws. Mr. Howell spent many years in the Wisconsin Dells at the Tommy Bartlett show, and he would be on stage juggling chainsaws. And he had to modify him. Notice there's two main modifications. The bars, he had a machinist drill holes in the bars to reduce weight. And then on the back side, on the end of the power head, he attached baseball bat handles, so he had something to grab on. I think he said the most he could get up in the air at one time were 3. And he's holding on to his kid right there. He's got his hands full. And he would juggle them. Before he started his act, he would have some wood on stage and cut through to show everybody this is real, and send the sawdust flying. And the chains would be running as he juggled them. Later, when electric chainsaws came out, he tried them, and nobody really was impressed. Why is that? Because they didn't make that engine sound. Everybody wanted to hear that vicious, revving, 2-stroke, yak, yak, yak sound. So he went back to the gas-powered saws. But again, Mr. Howell, why chainsaws? He could have juggled machetes or, axes or flaming torches, but it's the chainsaw that has that dangerous mojo in people's minds. And then here, this is a spray chart of chainsaw impact areas when you have an accident. Notice the head injuries. That's from kickback. And kickback is when this lower tip of the saw hits something and it violently bounces back at you. The bar is in 4 quadrants. If you were to make a dividing line here and a dividing line here, up here's the push, down here's the pull, here's the kickback, and this is called the attack. This part of the saw is what you have to be aware about. Think of this part of the saw as like the muzzle of a firearm. You want to always be aware of where it's pointed and where it's going. If you watch some YouTube videos, you can probably see some really funny examples of kickback, or people. There's one where a guy's cutting into his roof or something, and he just touches it like that, and it violently almost takes his head off. I think he's standing on a ladder too. And ladders and chainsaws don't mix very well. Okay, and then next. The hand area, the left hand, I believe that's from somebody grabbing like a tree branch and trying to hold it, and something goes wrong. And then the leg and foot area, that is often when you're bucking or cutting down brush, stuff like that. But all this is preventable. It really is. The first thing is education. There's chainsaw classes that you can take. Where's that gentleman from the Ice Age Trail? Yeah. They offer chainsaw classes, and that's a great opportunity to master the tool and get to know it if you're completely unfamiliar with using a chainsaw. I really recommend. There's classes, you can find them online. Universities and community colleges have them too. The other thing about chainsaw safety is, of course, simple power tool, safety gear such as safety glasses, ear protection, a hard hat. Sometimes if you're in your backyard and it's just a pile of logs and nothing is going to hit you from above, you don't need a hard hat. But I wear one always when I'm felling. You never know when a branch might break off from above, especially with ash trees, which we have millions of, and those branches are really brittle. And then the most important chainsaw safety gear is chaps. You gotta have the chaps. I've had so many close calls, and before I started using chaps, I wonder how I didn't cut my leg off. Chaps, they're made out of a Kevlar material. If your teeth touch them, the Kevlar, it snarls the moving teeth. And that's how it seizes up the chain. It's spinning around super fast, and it just seizes it up. And it snarls with the fibers of Kevlar. It works really well. I did it once by accident. I nicked my chaps, and it stopped like that. And then down by the feet, good work boots, steel toes, and you should be fine. So I studied a lot of the accident records in the OSHA archives, and what I concluded is chainsaws will not kill you. They'll just hurt you. They'll make you bleed. If you have an accident, you'll get some stitches. What will kill you are trees in motion. Death after death involving a chainsaw. The chainsaw just happened to be there. It was a tree that was somehow moving that crushed a person. And that's usually in the felling. Maybe it rolled. Somebody got pinned down. There's two examples that I cited in the book. One was a gentleman up north who was felling some trees. And he tried this technique where he made a cut and the tree was almost ready to fall. And then he cut a tree next to it so that would fall on top of the other one and they'd go down at the same time. I don't really see the point of that, but that's what he did. The tree took a bad bounce and it took off his lower leg above the ankle. He put a tourniquet on using his belt, made it back to his truck, started calling people, calling emergency on his cell phone. He survived. Another one was on the news. I just happened to see it on TV. It was a fellow up by Eau Claire who was cutting a tree that was broken off. So it'd be the upright trunk, and then it snapped off partly and it was going to the ground. He cut it in a way where the whole thing fell on top of him. And he had a cell phone in his pocket, was able to call for rescue, and the deputy that arrived on the scene grabbed his saw and started cutting the tree into chunks to get him out of there. It was lucky for him. I mean, he was at least conscious. I worked with some guys who had a friend that died on the job, and that was a tree, a log or a section of the tree being rigged down on a rope. It got out of control and it hit him and it killed him. So it's always, the saw isn't nothing to be scared of if you know how to use it and have your safety equipment and stuff like that. At most, maybe you might get nicked or something if you're not paying attention or doing something stupid. But it's the trees that are the real danger. So I went over all of the improvements and the design and the history of how the modern chainsaw all came together. Now, how can we make it even better and more awesome? This fellow right here is in Simcoe at the Threshery, where they have a chainsaw cutting competition. And chainsaws of all types were used, both modern and antique ones. And it's a gathering of chainsaw mechanics and chainsaw gearheads. Mr. Johnson, he's up in the Upper Peninsula. And as far as I know, he's one of the best chainsaw mechanics in North America. He has people sending him saws from all over the country to be ported. That means he tears apart the engine, does these modifications, and he can turn a 50cc saw into a 70cc saw, and it won't look any different than from when you bought it at the store. Basically, he turns chainsaws into hot rods, and they really rip. And these guys experiment with like aviation gas and all types of gasolines to get them faster. They modify the chains. to make them super light. And in this competition, to win, you make a cut down, a cut up, and a cut back down. And you're timed by 3 different judges. He won in many of the different categories. The categories are by engine size. So there's a lot of other ways that chainsaws are used. As far as I know, here in Wisconsin, in Fond du Lac, there are 2 machine shops that are the only ones in the entire world that modify chainsaws for cutting through ice. And that is for the sturgeon spearing on Lake Winnebago. You can use a regular chainsaw to cut through lake ice, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you do it enough, you're going to screw up your saw. Their modifications, notice the grease gun. It's that hand pump right there. They seal it up so water can't get into the power head. The bar is super long to cut through whatever thickness of ice it could be that winter. Maybe it's 2 feet or 3 feet, you never know. And then also they make modifications on the teeth of the chain. They file them down in this certain pattern and certain angle that's best for cutting through ice. This is a chainsaw gouger. This is Ben Bushke. He's a local chainsaw carver over in Manawa, and he was demonstrating to me on this modification. So you pop off the bar, and then you put on this assembly that has a belt, and then that turns the gouger, that circular thing on the end. It's about the size of a hockey puck. Then it has these notches in there. And that will just chew into the wood. And as you can see, it's just making these gouges. If you wanted to, on the top of that chunk of wood, you could just gouge in and create like a depression or a bowl. And it's a super useful tool for chainsaw carvers. And it'd be handy for anyone who likes woodworking. It's really neat. Similar to that, I don't have a photo of one, is a debarker. So it looks a little bit like that contraption. And then on the end, it's kind of like a cylinder, an old-fashioned cylinder lawnmower, where it rotates like this. And you want to take the bark off of a tree for some woodworking project. Well, there's 2 ways to do it. Hopefully you're doing it when it's green. And if you do it by hand, you can maybe do it with a hand tool, a chisel, and a pry bar and just peel the bark off. It's always easier when it's green. If it's dry, then it's 10 times more difficult. The debarker, it's like a little lawnmower, and you just shave the bark off the trunk or the log. Works really slick. Leaves a giant pile of sawdust. Here's another modification. This is the Lear Charger. The word Lear is the same fellow that created Lear jets. And what was that for? It's a battery charger. And he made it for bush pilots up in Alaska, Canada, where if they're stranded out in the middle of nowhere, they could charge their battery with a chainsaw. The chainsaw power head generates the energy, and then that converts into, right there's a battery clamp up on the bar. And there you go, you're bailed out. Another one is a modification to turn your chainsaw into an ice auger. And it could drill holes or post holes, or you could use it for ice fishing. Another modification is the Lewis winch, and that turns the power head into a winch. So you cut down the tree, there's a big heavy log, you want to move it from there to here, which is like, say, over by the trail or road or something. You would pop off the bar, add the winch unit, attach the saw to a tree or some type of anchor, and then you run out the cable, hook it up to the heavy object that you want to pull, fire up your saw, and pulls it right in. Pretty cool. So, while writing this book and learning about all these things, it is the most versatile tool probably in the world. It is the most dynamic tool. But mostly, what a reoccurring theme is, it's a tool for self-reliance. It's a tool for independent living. With the winch, you can get yourself out of a situation, whether you're stuck or need something to move. You can provide fuel, heating fuel for your family. You can make artistic creations. It's just incredible. Oh, and then one other thing. There's a YouTube video of some European guy on ice skates, and he takes his chainsaw and he puts it on the ice, and it bites into the ice and it pulls him around the lake. Pretty cool. But I thought about that. My first impression is that's neat, but it's really dangerous. If there's a little fissure in the ice and he trips up, he's going to land on a running chainsaw. So you think, man, that's kind of stupid. But if you think about it, all he would have to do is to modify a safety guard where almost the entire bar is covered, just this little tip is exposed, and he should be good. So what would that do? That would revolutionize travel on ice. I mean, if you want to go ice fishing, you have only a few choices to get to the hot spot. You either walk there, drive a snowmobile, ATV, that's it, or fire up a chainsaw. And pretty cool. So, yeah, it's incredible. And also, I mentioned in the book, they used a chainsaw for, there was a contest where they took a puck of wood and then had a chainsaw mounted on like a tripod, and it would shoot out, kind of like chainsaw frisbee. Yeah, it's, like I said, it's the most versatile tool in the world. Now, this is a really cool one. This is a fellow who I met that's building a cabin up in Wittenberg, out in the woods. His dream is to use wood from his land to build a cabin. So far, he's just only built an outhouse. But it's the most beautiful outhouse you've ever seen. Beautiful hardwood floors, and they're from his chainsaw. This is a chainsaw mill. So this contraption, you mount it up on a log, and then the saw sits horizontal, and these bars help guide it through the log so it's an even cut. You can adjust this, you can make a thin board or a thick one. You can make posts, big planks, whatever you want. What's really neat about that is he's harvesting the wood from land he owns, and to him that's very important. But also, he has a chance to capture some really beautiful wood. He has a lot of maple up there where he could get spalted maple, bird's eye maple. Who knows? Because you don't know what you're going to find until you cut into that wood and find some beautiful patterns, grains, and so on. Economically, yeah, I mean, if you're getting maple or oak hardwood and doing it yourself like this, you will save a lot of money as opposed to buying it from a lumber yard. You're just having better building materials. Ooh. Okay, that's the one I have here. This is electric. If you've never messed around with chainsaws before, get an electric one. They're super handy. I love this one, but not as much as I love my gas-powered Husqvarna. But this one, I reach for the most because it's really handy. for small stuff, backyard stuff, blowdowns after windstorms. It's great cleaning up the backyard, chopping up branches for kindling and firewood and backyard campfires. It's super slick. You charge up the battery. That orange or green circle, that's for bar oil. You just dump in the bar oil, have a charged battery, and you're ready to rip. The problem is they're not as strong as gas-powered saws. And then, of course, there's the battery issue. If you're in a remote area, you got to bring 20 batteries. As opposed to a gas saw, you'd bring a can of gas and some bar oil, and you can cut all weekend long. So that's the trade-off. But for backyard use, they're very useful. For the big stuff, cutting down big trees, big hardwoods, they will never beat a gas-powered saw. And then I went up to Eau Claire, which is the World Championship Chainsaw Sculpture competition. This lady was an exhibitor, and she was cutting into something. I recommend going. It is absolutely a really neat event. It's held every summer. There's a big circus tent, but you can't go in there because there's people from all over the world creating these incredible sculptures with their chainsaws, and they can't have, there's a big net. Because they don't, I mean, people are using chainsaws. You can't walk into the work area with this stuff going on. And also you should bring some earplugs because it's pretty loud. And the sculptures that you'll see and the talent, the artistic talent is mind-blowing. But take a look at this lady's saw. Notice it has a really pointy end. So that's another modification where chainsaws have been modified, different parts of the chainsaw for different purposes. That pointy end is able to make tiny, precise cuts and gouge and cut in there. And those pointy bars, they come in different sizes. And they're named after coins. There's like a dime size one, and like a nickel and a toonie, I believe. That's the Canadian coin. So after interviewing and talking to these chainsaw sculptors, I thought, man, I'd like to do that. But what am I going to make? I'm pretty creative. But I came up with this. It's a chair. Anyone can do it. It's very simple. So this is a dead ash tree near my house. And it was multi-stemmed, meaning it was like this. You had one stem going up and one going at a slight lean, and they were connected down close to the ground. So I dropped the stem that would be the seat, and that's gone out of the picture. The other one that was leaning off, which is the backrest, I felled that up higher in order to create the backrest. I flush cut the seat, and then for the backrest, I just made a long horizontal cut down to the seat, and then all that's left is to cut it off at the base, and there you got a chair for your campfire area. Just made in a few cuts. And if you don't like it, just throw it in the fire. But it's a really simple project. And then here I made a little stool, and I was experimenting around. So that was made, now that's a stool or a little ottoman, footrest, whatever, place to set your coffee or a can of beer. But that was made upside down. So if you imagine an upside down, the stump is about working level. And then to make the legs, I took a marker and cut them out, made the cuts. There's 4 legs. And then to cut out this space, I turned the bar horizontally and bore cut through, and then took out the blocks. The legs are formed. So the legs are sticking up this way, and then, and there, you got a little nifty stool. It's a little bit ugly. You can see how I made these overcuts right here. I was just fooling around. But yeah, there's a lot of neat chainsaw projects you can do. And you don't have to, you know, create a dragon or a bear sculpture to have fun with them. You can make simple things like this. Okay, that's down in Baraboo at the Aldo Leopold Foundation land. They have hundreds of acres, and they're using chainsaws to completely transform the landscape by cutting down a gigantic number of trees, which sounds weird because you think Aldo Leopold Foundation, they're a nature-focused group. Why would they want to cut down trees? They're trying to transform the landscape down there on a massive scale and return it to an oak savanna prairie that resembles pre-colonial times, back when Wisconsin had buffaloes. That is their mission. That's what the land used to look like. Now it's completely unrecognizable with species of trees that don't belong there, and they're restoring the land back to the way it is. That means, well, you think of a savanna. There's not too many trees on a savanna. So they're doing this massive thinning out. I visited there, and they were marking trees to be kept, trees to be removed. And they do an enormous amount of chainsaw work. That used to be covered with locusts. Black locust, it's an invasive species. There's plenty here in Waupaca. And they did it all by hand cutting, and they're completely transforming the landscape. The chainsaw is their main tool, but the companion tool to that is fire. After that, they scorch and burn the land to beat back all the invasive species that they don't want growing. Then they planted millions of prairie grass and native wildflower seeds. So in a few years, this is going to be just a beautiful prairie looking place. And you should probably know what this is. Those are the trails of the emerald ash borer larva as it appears underneath the bark. So if you peel the bark off a dead ash, you'll find these they're sort of pretty, kind of cool striations. The Waupaca River corridor is a dead zone of ash trees, and it's an extinction level event in North America. Your grandchildren won't see ash when they're grown up, and there's nothing that can be done, in my opinion. I think it's a lost cause. It's a shame. I think we should send China the bill. The silver lining is ash. It's a great firewood. It's one of the best. It burns wonderfully. It's a great hardwood. But when you're driving down the road, if you see a dead tree, it's probably an ash. Very, very high likelihood. And they should be removed because they're nothing but trouble. Dead trees are hazard trees. And you don't want to be standing around one on a windy day when it decides to break apart or fall down. So if you have a woodlot, try to keep it clean and get those out of there. And you might as well burn it. Have fun. And yeah, that's my book there. And I have books for sale here if anyone would like a copy.